Lightfall without a doubt was one of Destiny's most interesting years. For some, Lightfall's shaky debut was enough for them to solidify a negative judgment towards the game. For me personally, that's not really the case. In my opinion, Destiny's worst years were year 1 of D1, year 1 of D2, and year 3 of D2. That's because the word I would use to describe Destiny when it's at its worst is weak. The story is weak.
I don't even have time to explain why I don't have time to explain.
Its systems are weak. The rewards are weak.
I promised before that this was the most rewarding public event, and there we have it. We have 2 chests for a change, and check out those sweet moves.
Yeah.
And most importantly, the activities are weak.
Too many enemies on that support tower. Clear them out.
However, even in these times, there are still great moments. Vault of Glass, Prison of Elders, Escalation Protocol, The Whisper, and Prophecy are highlights of these years that come to my mind easily. Lightfall's year can be called a lot of things, but weak isn't one of them. The story had a few weak links in the chain, mainly a link named Nimbus, but overall I think it successfully carried on the arcs of several beloved characters throughout its seasons. The game's systems are the strongest they've ever been, with clear signs of where they can continue to grow. Finally, the activities are the most varied they've ever been, and provide the highest quality and quantity of rewards we've ever seen. Despite these strengths, I have analyzed 3 big pain points I'll mention throughout the rest of the video that I think make up Destiny's Achilles heel and hold some people's spirits about the game down, even though this is arguably one of Destiny's best years. On top of those points, I feel that it was easy to feel disdain towards Lightfall due to aspects that aren't part of the playable game, but instead events that happened in Destiny's social circle. For example, shortly after Lightfall's release, Lance Reddick unfortunately passed away too early at 60 years young. Later in the year, there was a firing of about 100 Bungie employees, which was followed by one of the rudest messages from an executive I've ever read in my life. So far. These 2 events took the wind out of everybody's sails and brought forth a lot of reflection about our relationship with this game. I think it is normal to connect your feelings about such events to Destiny because they're correlated. Personally, I prefer to separate the art from the artist. What happens at Bungie or to the people that work with or for Bungie does not affect my feelings towards Destiny. It's no surprise to many that Bungie makes some baffling decisions at times, such as that starter pack they tried selling at the beginning of Season of the Wish. However, I respect many of the individuals that put their lives into expanding the Destiny universe. For example, I'm always smiling during those VDOC sections when Dave Samuel and Eric Smith are showing off new abilities, or how passionately Chris Proctor talks about his work on podcasts. Their passion is infectious. You can really tell that they love Destiny and love working on it. There's also another person who really loves Destiny. Me. This universe resonates and speaks to me at a personal level that only a few other game series do. Outside of a few narrative mishaps, difficulty debates, and PvP woes, my claim for this video is that I think this year was one of Destiny's strongest. I'm gonna cover everything I think went right and wrong throughout this past expansion year by using the template Joe Blackburn laid out in his February 2023 State of the Game, which broke down all his plans for the game into 4 distinct categories. If that's the angle this year's worth of content was built from, then that feels like the perfect angle to review this year's worth of content from. Before I start, 2 disclaimers. 1, I feel that many Destiny review/analysis videos on YouTube start to turn into Bungie reviews halfway through. I want to avoid that pitfall, and as I said earlier, I prefer to separate the art from the artist anyways. 2, this is not a review meant to encourage purchasing Lightfall or any other Destiny expansion, rather a reflection piece of this year's journey since this game is an important part of my life, and I'm still excited to see how this series continues after almost a full decade of playing it. Without further ado, welcome to my review/analysis of the entire year of Destiny 2 Lightfall. This first section focuses on the evolution of new Destiny activities and the systems we have as players to engage with those activities. One of the big pain points during Witch Queen's year was the lack of innovation in seasonal activities. Seasons always consisted of either battlegrounds, a 6-man match-made activity, or a public event. This lack of innovation and stagnant release pattern was breeding a lot of apathy towards the game. The seasonal menu needed some spice, and this year sought to address that issue. In my opinion, spice was successfully added to the seasonal dish, but I think we can add more. Activities such as Deep Dives, Altars of Summoning, Savathun's Spire, the Coil, and Onslaught were solid attempts at deviating from that previously established formula. Elements from other genres such as roguelites and deck builders were incorporated to help give these activities more replay value. These elements show a lot of promise, but they felt like a bonus to the activity, and I would like to see them bake deeper into the core of new activities in the future. The Coil was the most successful at this. Collecting motes for score and spending at Riven felt more integral to how I played the activity compared to selecting the perk nodes and deep dives and drawing cards and altars of summoning. Another change activities saw was a steady escalation of difficulty throughout their runtime. To be fair, Escalation Protocol did this 6 years ago. It was very successful, and I don't know why activities stopped doing this, but I'm glad we're back to this being a regular mechanic. Having activities gradually gain resistance makes them more engaging to beat, since you actually need to optimize and strategize your loadouts. The Coil and Onslaught have become some of the most popular activities across all the different activities released over the last few years, and I believe this is a big contributor why. Apart from all the rewards, obviously. Looking a little closer into these activities, you can start to nitpick some things that didn't work well, like the method to increase difficulty in deep dives. Matchmade groups wouldn't be on the same page, and someone would usually end up rage quitting because they weren't getting the experience they wanted when they launched the activity. The Deck of Whispers was a really cool idea, however its implementation was unintuitive and unbalanced. Going back to the helm to switch my active cards meant I never bothered to switch my cards. Even if it was more convenient to switch cards, I still wouldn't have anyways, because Blades providing unlimited heavy was the best card by a long shot, and its existence removed any notion of making different deck builds. Despite this harsh criticism towards the Deck of Whispers, I do want to see deck building tried again because I think there's still potential in that idea. I think giving the cards more synergy with each other would be a step in the right direction. Problems like these stems from the growing pains of innovation, and in my opinion, that's a good problem to have, and why I'm not too critical about mistakes such as these. I think the worst thing to do would be abandoning these ideas because they weren't a home run on the first swing. While seasonal activities got noticeably more interesting, there's still some stale predictability with seasons, and it all stems from the narrative's presentation. Since Season of the Chosen's success, every season since has decided to stick to that formula. That formula was fresh 3 years ago, but we are well past its expiration date. Talking to a character, then going to the holo projector, it's usually a conversation with the person I was just talking to, then finally going to the radio is the part of seasons I'm 100% done with. I liked most of the actual story told this year, but the way it was delivered needed to be much more compelling. This is where I hope the episodes with Final Shape innovate the most. Hopefully each episode is told in a unique style that makes the story more engaging and memorable. I do still love those ink brush cutscenes though. Those always go hard and never get old to me. Moving from activities to systems, I want to start with weapon crafting. Weapon crafting feels perfected, or at least close to it. Getting rid of all those bloated currencies from Witch Queen's launch, streamlining the red border acquisition process, and adding features like being able to spend glimmer and cores to level up weapons were amazing improvements. The only feedback I have for crafting at this point is to question its existence. There's a stark divide between players and their opinions when it comes to weapon crafting. Some players go to the extremes of wanting every single gun in the game craftable, or wishing crafting never existed. I think most players, such as myself, sit in the middle because it's easy to see both sides. On one hand, RNG can be a cruel mistress, and it is relieving to know that you will get exactly what you want after a few hours in an activity. On the other hand, there is no reason to ever keep a single random drop of a seasonal weapon, and I kinda think this is a problem. It doesn't matter if one run of the activity rewards me with 1 weapon or 100 weapons. If they're not a red border, then I don't care, and I don't think that's healthy for an activity's reward structure. The biggest offender to killing any sort of seasonal chase is enhanced perks. Not only is crafting the easiest way to get what you want, it also provides you with a slightly better version of the gun that's impossible to get from random drops. This is why the statement, "just don't craft the weapon, bro," doesn't work. I could keep grinding instead of crafting, but enhanced perks makes that a pointless decision because I would never get something better than what I could craft. Perks on select groups of random rolled guns becoming enhanceable with the final shape is a change that I'm looking forward to, but I don't think it will completely alleviate the damage because now random drops in crafted weapons are on par with each other instead of crafted weapons being flat out better. I personally think it needs to be flipped, where random rolls are just marginally better than crafted rolls. That way crafted weapons are solid, can compete in just about pretty much any content in the game, but for the real min-maxers, you gotta keep grinding. Overall, I do think enhanced perks were a mistake, but adding them was opening Pandora's box, and there's no going back from that decision. I don't know if it's just because of the enhanced perks, but there's this atmosphere that I'm going to refer to as the thrill of the hunt that is almost completely dead in most activities. I personally love grinding random rolls. It's why I've enjoyed chasing the brave weapons so much. I'm also a huge advocate for any form of RNG protection to help make the chase more palatable. Dungeons and Iron Banner are the biggest offenders currently on having drops with no RNG protection. At the very least, Iron Banner should have multiple perks on rank resets, and Master Dungeons should have double perks on every weapon drop. Also, Dungeons feel bad because of armor drops being completely useless, but that is a separate topic. The newest form of RNG protection added to the game is attunement. It's a wonderful new tool to help put drops in your favor that I would like to see incorporated into more areas of the game. For example, World Loot should have the attunement system at Banshee. Attunement could also use a few touch-ups. An improvement I think would be nice is not only having attunement give your desired weapon a 50% drop chance, but also if that attuned weapon hasn't appeared within 3 to 4 drops, then the next drop is guaranteed to be the attuned weapon to counter long bad luck streaks. It could also have the ability to remove a couple of undesirable perks from weapon drops, like the lure from Season of the Hunt's activity. I'm shocked that feature has never made a return since. Another big change to the sandbox was Mods 2.0. 801's Armor Mod Lotto was not a fun experience for newer returning Guardians who needed to catch up on their mod collection. Mods 2.0 was made to fix problems like this, with the goal of making build crafting as accessible as possible. Everyone gets access to every mod in the game, and armor mods have their own dedicated UI for even more player convenience. While simplifying these systems can sting a little for dedicated hardcore players such as myself, I'm a firm believer that changes like this are beneficial to everyone in the long run. Mods 2.0 allows armor mods to have cleaner, more robust foundation to build from. My only disappointment was that this new foundation was not built upon as much as I thought it would have been from the start. It felt like new mods were supposed to be released regularly throughout the year, and they never did outside of Powerful Attraction and Elemental Charge at the beginning of Deep. Given that most of the attention mods got throughout the year was dedicated to balancing them, I hope to see that attention shift to the creation of new mods next year. Loadouts have been one of the most heavily requested features over the last few years. Back when D2 launched, the need for loadouts wasn't really applicable because gun rolls were static, armor stats were basically non-existent, and subclasses only had 2 choices to pick from. From Forsaken onward, we were slowly gaining depth back to our builds, and by the time fragments on subclasses were a thing and Beyond Light, loadouts were looking really appealing. Sure enough, their existence is super welcome. Being able to swap loadouts anywhere in the game instantly was honestly my favorite addition Lightfall brought. The unsung use of loadouts for me was improving my fashion game, which every Guardian knows is the true endgame. Previously, I almost never changed my fashion because it was too cumbersome, but now it's super easy to have a separate look for each build. The only thing that really stands out is a needed quality of life improvement, would being able to remove specific parts of a loadout or just clear a loadout entirely. Also, 10 more slots please. The last impactful quality of life change that came later in the year was Vault from Orbit. When this one was announced, I didn't really think too much about it, but since its release, I couldn't imagine playing without it. It was confirmed that this feature is getting expanded on during the Final Shapes year, so that the Vault can even be accessed from certain activities, which is really appreciated. Now, if only I could swap gear between characters in-game, then I would never have to use the companion app ever again. The next thing I want to touch on is that this year, overall, did a much better job at giving weapons good perk variety, especially on raid weapons. Last year, Valve the Disciple weapons had one role that was superior to the rest, such as Cataclysmic with 4th times the charm bait and switch, Deliverance with Demolitionist chill clip, and Forbearance with Ambitious Assassin chain reaction. This year, the Root of Nightmares weapons had a wide variety of good perks on their weapons. For example, the auto rifle Rufus's Fury is solid, having a mixture of rewind rounds, reconstruction, or demolitionists, paired with frenzy, hatchling, target lock, or paracausal affinity. I personally prefer demo frenzy on mine, but I've seen all sorts of combinations on other people's Rufus's Fury that are tailored to their playstyle. I felt that Crota's End weapons, the reprised Last Wish weapons, and the Brave Arsenal also did a better job with there being multiple viable perks instead of a best in slot. I feel that the sandbox is healthier when there's multiple god rolls on a weapon that depend on a player's preference rather than there just being one god roll that is clearly above every other perk combination. The dream would be if every perk could be a competitive option and we stopped getting perks like Under Over. Now, if anything expanded our imaginations, it was Strand. Strand is one of the best additions to Destiny's sandbox in its 9-year life. It was designed with the goal of having a high action per minute gameplay loop, and the designers working on Strand achieved that goal with flying colors. Strand is versatile and fluid. Its wide variety of tools can be chained together seamlessly, which creates a unique feel from the other 4 pre-existing subclasses. Doing combos like this hasn't lost its luster over the past year of Strand's existence. Strand was also integrated into the game much more smoothly than Stasis was 2 years prior. Stasis was infamously terrorizing the Crucible for almost the entirety of Beyond Light's year, and Stasis weapons weren't even getting added regularly until Season of the Lost, which was almost the end of the expansion's year. Strand weapons were added right away with the launch of Lightfall. The only outlier that had to be reined in was Suspend, because it was just too good of a verb at keeping enemies immobilized. Suspend was the one-size-fits-all solution to all PvE activities, and its nerf halfway through the year was completely expected and warranted. Strand builds have been a regular loadout I use on all 3 characters since Lightfall's launch. Even with the upcoming Prismatic subclass, I see myself switching back to Strand from time to time, whether it's for Banner of War with Synthoceps, the Wanderer with Swarmers, or Whirling Maelstrom with Foe Tracer. Destiny continues to evolve and maintain what I think is the most interesting and versatile first-person shooter sandbox in the video game history. This is the one area of the game where I think there's little complacency. There's always new toys to play with, and it's the main reason I keep playing and enjoying this game so much. During 2022, we got 3.0 subclasses, which ended up being powerful and fun at first. However, continuously mowing through huge waves of enemies without even trying gets boring fast, to me at least. I remember the GMs of Plunder and Seraph starting to become boring, and GMs never felt boring prior to those seasons. This past year sought to fix that. Challenge and Destiny would return by tuning abilities and adjusting enemy power across the entire game. The line of player power had to come down a bit, and just like public trade investors, the no nerfs only buffs crowd freaks out if the line stops going up. There's always been controversial balance tuning in Destiny, starting all the way back with that classic .04% auto rifle buff. This is where we finally reach one of Destiny's 3 pain points, death by 1,000 cuts. With the game going on this long and having put thousands of hours into it, you get to know the game at a super intimate level. Small intricacies swell up and carry more meaning than they really should. It's like living with a partner for 9 years and they still don't put the cap back on the toothpaste or leave the toilet seat up. It's not that annoying at first, but it builds over time. With how much Destiny's sandbox fluctuates, there's bound to be at least one change every so often that does not sit well with you. Bonus points if the nerf's reasoning originates from PvP, but ends up noticeably harming the item's PvE performance. Now, I've never reached the point with a balance update where I'm malding over any of the changes. Honestly, if you quit a game only over balance changes because it feels like a personal attack, then I think that says more about you than the game or its developers. The worst you get out of me with a poor balancing decision is a face palm. The chill clip nerf is an example of a change that gets that face palm. Chill clip was an overpowered perk, being a one-size-fits-all solution to stun champions with its slow and freezing capabilities. A nerf was warranted, but the execution of that nerf was terrible. Riptide, which was the main outlier due to its fast rate of fire, hardly lost its effectiveness, but slower niche options like Lingering Dread were hit very hard to the point where using it in a build isn't worth the effort anymore. Thankfully, this nerf is about to be reverted almost completely when Final Shape launches, but you can't help but feel we shouldn't have been down this road in the first place. Death by 1,000 cuts is less important than the other two issues I see with the game, since some of it stems from people that really need to take a break or retire from Destiny due to their own habits with the game. My favorite is when people misread patch notes and get angry about what they misread. For example, a few months ago, threadling damage got nerfed against players, only since they were oppressive in Crucible. Some people freaked out about threadlings getting nerfed in PvE due to PvP. An extra bullet point had to be added to the patch notes, specifying this was a PvP only change because apparently specifying player damage only wasn't clear enough. Does this knight look like a player to you? Maybe he's seeing some extra wizards that he's not telling us about. While I do agree it's overdramatic, I know enough negative changes stop people from playing the game, mainly if too many of these types of changes happen within a short window of time. Which is why the most controversial set of nerfs this year came at the beginning of Season of the Wish. The targeted changes by this update focused on reducing the effectiveness of orb generation, healing sources, and ability regen at the same time. Orb generation mods like Firepower were insanely overtuned with mods 2.0. It felt like we could generate 4 to 5 times the number of orbs than any previous year. After the nerf, I still generate enough orbs to almost constantly have my boot surges active during an encounter, which is more than enough for me. I found these nerfs to be reasonable. When it comes to reducing healing and damage resist sources, I also agree with those decisions. It was so simple to out-heal any damage no matter the difficulty, which was skewing every difficulty option in the game towards easy mode. An easy game is a boring game, and a boring game is a game I stop playing fast. Also, it's not like healing sources don't get buffed from time to time. Precious Scars and Heal Clip are some examples of more recent buffs that make survivability easier. Also, Restoration feels so much better to build into on Solar after all the bugs with their timer resetting was fixed. I think Void Overshields are the only survivability tool that needs a PvE buff. Its usefulness just lags behind everything else. Ability regen nerfs are a little more nuanced. Some of these changes were well warranted, but felt like the equivalent of a teacher finally collecting some homework that was due a month ago. Sure, you had to get around to it at some point, but after this much time has passed, some people start to question, why did you even bother? Bonk Hammer is a prime example. It has been ridiculously strong since Solar 3.0 launched, with it being able to now be used with sunspots, and its nerf was about a year overdue. I could tell the nerf was pretty justified and fair given that I have rarely seen complaints about it since. The only change for Bonk Hammer I would make is to have it instantly recharge if you don't hit a target. On the other hand, having ability energy refunded proportionally to the ability's cooldown time instead of a universal refund sounds like a smart idea. However, I can't help but feel there's some rough edges in the sandbox from this change that are in dire need of being smoothed out. It's been a common complaint since this update that kickstart mods are completely useless. The only thing I'll add to that conversation is that I know between the 30 build slots on my account, there is not a single kickstart mod equipped. The real problem with these cooldown changes is that none of them did anything to rein in the true outliers, like Sunbracers, Assassin's Cowl, and Banner of War. Instead, many noticed their more niche picks got hit the hardest, which doesn't feel particularly great.
Stop! Stop! He's already dead!
I'm not going to pretend all the balance updates to the game were nerfs. Hand cannons got a huge glow up halfway throughout the year, and are now arguably the strongest primary in the game. Pulses look to be getting similar treatment when the final shape launches. Exotic armor like Vesper Radius and Foe Tracer got reworks that sent them from 0 to hero. A lot of older exotic weapons got new life put into them, with catalysts or becoming craftable, such as Vorpal on Malfeasance and Rapid Hit on Outbreak. On the other end of the balance scale, we have the changes to enemy difficulty. Most activities in the game now cap a player's power at a specific level, so that an activity can't be overleveled and is always somewhat challenging. For example, Legend and Master have minus 15 and minus 20 power deficits respectively. What I really like about this change to enemy difficulty is that we are finally pushing away from the archaic power level grind. Power level was always a nuisance, and it has been feeling like a dated mechanic for a while. It really exasperated the treadmill grind problem. You had to play through a bunch of boring stuff so that you were high enough level to do the new dungeon or GMs. This year was the first one where the power level cap was never raised during any season after Lightfall's launch. This change was so welcome for me. Destiny gets a lot of flack for not respecting the player's time, so this was a nice step towards changing that notion. I did see some pushback at the beginning of Lightfall where people would leave annoyed comments like, "So what's the point of power level then?" And I'm just sitting there thinking, dude, there never was a point. We finally have enough progression through other avenues that we can finally get closer to phasing out this old-ass system. The debut of these enemy difficulty changes was set out to shake up one of Destiny's oldest, stalest activities, Patrol. Neomuna was an attempt to liven Patrol the same way Witch Queen's legendary campaign was an attempt to liven campaigns. Unlike the universal acclaim Witch Queen's campaign received, the Patrol changes had a more mixed reception. I enjoyed Neomuna's combat difficulty a lot because having enemies tanky enough to put up a fight makes the game more engaging for me. Every other Patrol destination is pretty much a snooze fest. However, I think it was silly to not have difficulty options for players to choose from. I think a lot of complaints came from those who aren't comfortable with fighting combatants with a power deficit, which is fair criticism, especially if it's their first time being forced into a zone like this. I think patrols as a whole would benefit from a world tier type system like the Division used. Patrols seem like they're meant to be the basic resource grind activity, so having higher difficulties that award a lot more resources would be nice for experienced players such as myself. On top of moving over to a more traditional difficulty system, modifiers were adjusted for all activities. The best change in this department was the removal of Match Game. However, after the celebrated death of Match Game, a new heir took the throne of the most hated modifier, Togetherness. This Crimson Days leftover wormed its way into a lot of activities this year. Thankfully, outcry about how terrible it is got it removed from the coil, and I doubt its ugly face will return in the future. You're next, Grounded. On top of this, we got some new modifiers, which mainly consisted of surges, threats, and overcharges. Surges and threats are just the old elemental burns, but with the increased player damage and enemy damage separated into their own components. Overcharges are specific weapon class damage buffs, and they can't stack with a surge. I think these modifiers are an improvement over the acute burns from last year, but I do have some ideas to spice things up that I want to share. Those ideas are subclass verb synergy and subclass verb effectiveness. I wrote these down before Prismatic was revealed, but I think they complement the idea of that subclass quite nicely. With subclass verb synergy, the main idea is that there should be combo bonuses for mixing verbs from different subclasses. I don't know how hard Prismatic will lean into this, but Season of the Wish has an artifact mod called Torch, which states, while radiant, you deal increased weapon damage to combatants affected by strand and stasis debuffs. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg for new ways to add interesting depth to build crafting and team composition. Some example perks I thought up of include Short Circuit. Jolted targets will receive double scorch stacks from all sources for quicker ignitions. The Best Defense, combining Void Overshield with Frost Armor, makes you immune to all debuffs. And Purifying Plague. Curing yourself will release a shockwave that applies volatile to nearby surrounding targets. I would like to add, I want to see perks like this not just be put into artifacts, but also exotics, armor mods, and fragments. Moving on to my other sandbox improvement idea, I think enemies need more reactivity to subclass verbs. We saw a change with Lightfall's launch where champions can be stunned by subclass verbs. This seemingly small change on paper was honestly a huge shakeup to how I engage with endgame content. I rarely, if ever, feel pigeonholed into using a crappy weapon just for champion stunning anymore. If there's unstops, I can run Strand. Overloads are hard countered by guns with chill clip, and Radiant makes barriers a breeze, especially during Season of the Wish. I want to see this pushed into most of the game's tougher elites. I think combatants like Wyverns, Briggs, and Tormentors should be resistant to certain verbs while being weak to others, kind of like Pokemon type effectiveness. Those were some ideas I had to spice up the sandbox more than this year's modifiers added. I actually think Destiny's in a pretty good spot with balance across the game's wider ecosystem, and I think the difficulty changes helped push the ecosystem to that better spot. It's only on specific components that you can see some broken pieces that need to be addressed. The biggest issue I see is that we need more regular buffs to shitty exotic armor. This section of the article was about adding depth to Destiny's previously established content, which is why I'm going to review the campaign, exotic missions, raids, dungeons, and the core playlists next. I'm starting this section off with the campaign. The campaign is the first impression for a Destiny year, and for many, this year didn't look too favorable. For me personally, I actually liked most of the campaign, despite its clear faults that I agree with. That's because Lightfall's campaign had strong encounter design, and is honestly my favorite campaign purely from a gameplay perspective. My favorite campaign narratively was Witch Queen, and my favorite campaign for the vibes was Forsaken, because avenging everyone's favorite Hunter Vanguard through the journey of a Western just felt so right for the soul. When it came to the encounters of Lightfall's campaign, they were fast-paced with high ad density, which felt satisfying to play through. Racing out of Callus's ship, grappling out of an exploding building, and the classic Destiny tank section were some highlights for me. The peak of this campaign was holding the line with Kaido's forces. In my opinion, that's a top 3 Destiny campaign moment.
Guardian, it's our day to die. We shall be immortalized in legend together.
Calling in orbital lasers on tanks, seeing Cabal war against Cabal, that triple Tormentor threat as the grand finale. I love the way all of them slowly approach because it's so foreboding, and then it gets insanely hectic once they're all enraged. This was the first Destiny campaign I actually looked forward to playing through on an alternate character. Even the Witch Queen was a slog through a second character, since the story reveals and puzzles were what kept interest high during its runtime, which lose all luster after the first playthrough. On the story side of this experience, Nimbus made a few too many Marvel tier quips, which made them an easy target to put the blame on for a subpar story.
Well, the uglier they are, the harder they fall, right?
But I can assure you, Lightfall's narrative woes are a little more nuanced than that. There's some interesting content being discussed in this campaign, but the pacing is so poor because too much is being fit in at once. Across 8 missions in a strike, these are all the topics crammed into them. Mastering Strand, the Witness and Callus's alliance, the Radial Mass, the Cloud Arc, Osiris coming to terms that he lost his light, a teaser for Nezarec in the Root of Nightmares raid, the city of Neomuna and its citizens, Cloud Striders, and most importantly,
The Veil.
The Veil.
the Veil. There's way too much fighting for your attention, and I don't think any of these topics got enough screen time to be fulfilling, even when you factored the post-campaign exotic missions, lost sectors, and partitions. The moment I think shows off this lack of focus as the campaign's core weakness was Rohan's death. Since there's so much information being given to the player, I feel that it is impossible to form any sort of meaningful connection to Rohan prior to his death. Problems others voiced, like the campaign focusing too much on mastering Strand, or Nimbus having unnecessary humor, are symptoms of Rohan's death not feeling impactful. If I did care about Rohan, then I would have been more sympathetic to the way Nimbus used humor to cope. Or, I would have been more eager to master Strand so that I can avenge him. Rohan's death was definitely meant to give us more motivation to master Strand, stop Callus, and save Neomuna, but it just ended up giving us nothing. Overall, I think the topics brought up in Lightfall's campaign didn't get the proper space to breathe. This is why I actually want to see a future episode expand on Neomuna, because there's so much here that could be explored in depth. After experiencing Nimbus's more somber side in the deterministic Chaos quest, I also think Nimbus has the potential to redeem themselves in the public eye, and not be banished to the Shadow Realm with failsafe. Moving on from the campaign, it is not breaking news to anyone that regularly plays this game that the core playlists have really been struggling for the last few years. Year 5 was especially egregious because seasonal challenges would ask you to play these modes, and you would quickly realize nothing substantial has been added to Strikes, Crucible, and Gambit in what feels like forever. Let's see if Year 6 attempted to move the needle in this area of the game at all. This year, Destiny players asked each other the most important question they've ever had to answer. Is a battleground a strike? This question got thrown around this year because the battlegrounds from last year's seasons entered the Strike and Nightfall playlist, and some people weren't a fan. I'm gonna say it, battlegrounds were a great addition to the basic Strike playlist, and especially the Nightfall playlist. I was getting so tired of the same handful of strikes the past few years, especially Glassway appearing in 6 of the 8 seasonal Nightfall rotations from Beyond Light to Lightfall. Battlegrounds were popular during their debut season from their high enemy density, and I've been a fan of them since. I like having big waves of enemies to fight, so GMs giving enemies enough resistance to be threatening made mowing through their heavy density very satisfying. I think the extra variety and challenge that Battlegrounds added to the Grandmaster Nightfall experience made them a lot more interesting and therefore more fun this year compared to last year. Most complaints from others towards this change stem from skill issues and not liking that these GMs can't be farmed in 10 minutes like Saber. The only GM Battleground that felt like it consistently took a long while was the Psyops Cosmodrome one. All the other GMs, my teams would get down to 20 to 25 minutes, which is pretty par for the course for most of the normal strikes. Outside of this great debate, we also saw the return of strike scoring, which is something that never should have left in the first place. Traveling from the blue circle to the red circle, let's talk PvP. I occasionally see people say that PvP is the lifeblood of Destiny, and all I have to say to them is I'm sorry, brother, but Crucible is the side mode of this game. While I do dabble in PvP a bit throughout the year, mainly when Iron Banner rolls around, it's rarely my first choice of activity when booting the game up. Imagine booting up Destiny just to play Rumble. Toxic memes aside, I do feel bad for the lack of meaningful content PvP players have had for years, and it's honestly embarrassing how long this section of the game has languished. At the beginning of Lightfall, everything was looking par for the course, meaning PvP has continued to not get a significant addition for players to sink their teeth into. Thankfully, a PvP strike team was made halfway through the year, and we have just been recently experiencing the fruits of their labor. This labor consists of new systems, new game modes, but most importantly, new maps. Things started to look up for Crucible during Season of the Witch, when there was a Trials Armor refresh, new game modes such as Relic and Checkmate, and a new map, Multiplex. Now to be honest, most of this stuff was pretty mid, and if this year was anything like the prior ones, then this would have been it for the year's PvP content. Thankfully, this time it was just the start. A lot of new systems were being tested in that checkmate mode I just mentioned. Eventually, some of those systems wiggled into the core Crucible experience. The most notable one being the special ammo meter. I think the special ammo bar is an excellent idea that is an upgrade over ammo dropping from other Guardians. Special ammo feels like it's fairly paced over a match's duration, instead of it being feast or famine because previously your drops depended on your enemy's loadout. It also provides a new avenue for balance. Previous balancing changes to special ammo would affect every special weapon. Overperforming special weapons can now have their special meter charge rate independently reduced. For new game modes, hardware finally gives people a chance to play the Crucible with only guns and no abilities. Call of Duty's iconic Hardpoint mode joined Destiny's game mode roster under the name Collision. I really like the tribute mode that was added to Iron Banner, but I'm well aware that I'm in the minority for that one. I'm also the type of person that would totally be into a game mode that had an immune tormentor stalking the map, because I just love chaos. However, nothing tops what happened during Into the Light. It did what many thought was impossible. It added 3 Crucible maps at the same time. When the Spotlight only has a single new map, it's gonna get torn to shreds, because it's gotta be good at everything. Getting 4 maps in an expansion year is hopefully the norm for this point onward, because I don't think it's that unreasonable of an ask. As someone on the more casual side, I can feel the improvements and appreciate the effort took to add life to this section of the game. Hopefully the more dedicated PvP crowd saw most of the recent additions as a W. Now for that green mode everyone loves playing. No? Well, at least Gambit got the biggest announcement since the release of Gambit Prime 5 years ago. That announcement? Gambit isn't getting any substantial changes anytime soon, and probably ever. I'm personally very glad there was a definitive statement about the future of Gambit, despite it not being one that some people want to hear. After Witch Queen's unsuccessful attempt at a revival, teams at Bungie decided it's not worth the try again. The last attempt had the goal to make Gambit more structured. I think they succeeded in that goal, but there's one problem. Gambit is boring when it's structured, and I think Gambit is at its best when it's completely chaotic. Gambit was so much fun those first few weeks of Forsaken because it was this frenzied mess and felt like the lawless frontier it was trying to be. Gambit's fate is a bit of a shame, but I can assure you, I'm not losing sleep over it. Next up, raids and dungeons. They're my bread and butter. Vault of Glass is what wowed and hooked me back in 2014, and I've been wowed again every year since. When it comes to Root of Nightmares, I find it to be one of the most aesthetically pleasing raids created. The white roots piercing through the Witness's ship, along with the portal on the Traveler hanging in the skybox during the entire raid's runtime, makes for such whimsical imagery. It feels like you're traversing a dream that's larger than life. Destiny's no stranger to these types of environments. The Dreaming City, Black Garden, and Savathun's Throne World invoke similar feelings. The only other games that I've played that make sci-fi environments like this are the Super Mario Galaxies, Outer Wilds, Subnautica, and the end of most Kirby games. The idea that space can be anything, such as planets made of toys or a planet with a black hole in the middle of it, is what makes sci-fi my favorite setting. I wish more games took this approach to making space feel big, rather than trying to simulate the real scale of space. The music is also a real standout in this raid. Eyes Up has been my undisputed favorite raid theme since 2016, mainly because of that Siva density critical part. Nezarek's theme, One Aerophobia, is the first theme since Axis that I have loved on that same level. All the motifs of the Guardian, the Cabal, the Darkness, and Lightfall mix into what I think is pure musical genius. I also like Nezarek's design as much as I enjoy his theme. Nezarek has this eldritch horror vibe to him that I want to see more of in Destiny. It's a vibe that makes him fit alongside the pantheon of Kirby final bosses like Magolor, Zero 2, and Void Termina. Art direction and character design aren't the only part of Root that gives me Kirby vibes, its relaxed difficulty does as well. Despite Root of Nightmares having the highest ad density of any raid to date, we have a lot of tools to deal with that high ad density with ease. Ads are 0 threat on normal, and a minor to medium threat on master. This means difficulty can only come from the mechanics. For 3/4 of the raid, that mechanic is connecting the dots, and the encounters only require at most 2 people to do them. This means there's very little that can go wrong during the first half of the raid. The only thing I think that would even give problems in the second encounter were the flingers. Those flingers gave me a little bit of PTSD to the trample steam from Black Ops 2 Zombies. The Expliciter is the real standout for the entire raid. It requires most of the fire team to be competent players, and it fairly punishes slip-ups with poor recovery. Unfortunately, this encounter is the exception rather than the norm, which leads to Root of Nightmares feeling a little incomplete. Ghosts of the Deep was the next endgame release. Contrary to what I've seen from others, I think only the first part of the dungeon is a drag, and the rest is peak dungeon design. The first encounter requiring 4 statue dunks is one too many. Why are we going against the standard rule of 3s here? The 4th dunk adds nothing meaningful to the encounter. The first traversal portion has amazing spectacle, but the length makes this part overstay its welcome after the first couple of runs. Ector is one of my favorite boss fights in the series due to how chaotic and layered this fight is. Samuma drags solo, but with a solid team, I've never had a problem 2-phasing her. I find this fight to be just as chaotic and therefore fun. Most complaints I've seen about this boss boil down to skill issues. Overall, a solid dungeon that's one of my favorites due to its incredible set pieces, spectacle, and boss design. Seeing Oryx's dead body with the ghost over its chest is a Destiny moment I'll never forget. Crota was the D1 raid reprisal most Destiny raiders didn't want, but ended up being the one they needed. After how relaxed Root of Nightmares was, some hardcore raiders feared for the difficulty of future raids. Now, given that Vow and Kingsfall had respectable difficulty last year, and Root is a sample size of 1, this reaction is a little silly and dramatic in my opinion. The announcement of Crota's return gave those worries a little more validation due to how easy the D1 version was. Most people expected D2 Crota's end to be just as relaxed as it was in the original. However, D2 Crota was anything but relaxed. The Hive Prince was back with a vengeance. It was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. There were more traps out in the Abyss, Ear Ute became a proper boss fight, and most importantly, The Chalice of Light got completely reworked. The Chalice was only used during the Crota encounter back in D1, and if I'm remembering properly, it was not that super integral to the fight. This time, the Chalice is used throughout the entire raid to pass an Enlighten buff so people can light lamps, charge plates, and pick up the Sword Relic. This time, even the Abyss is capable of skill checking uncoordinated teams with ease. Out of all the current D1 raid reprisals, this one's my favorite due to how much effort was put into bringing this raid up to current standards. Looking back, Season of the Witch was pretty much a direct sequel to Dark Below that was well made this time. Comparing these two releases really puts the full journey of how this game has evolved over almost a decade. The second dungeon this year was Warlord's Ruin. Set in a castle that spans across some mountains near the EDZ, this dungeon was another delight to experience. I enjoyed this dungeon so much that I felt inspired to make a video about castle levels in video games always being bangers. The level design and boss design are easily some of the best this game has ever seen. The loot was really the only part that received some healthy criticism. Thankfully, Indebted Kindness is here to offset what's mostly a subpar loot table. It's a shame that dungeons each year are behind a $20 price tag, and this prevents a lot of people from experiencing some of Destiny's best content. I'll touch more on this topic in this video's next section. The final PvE endgame activity that was released this year was Pantheon. Pantheon might just be the best content I've ever played in Destiny ever. Raids and dungeons are my favorite activities in the game, so having a raid boss rush with escalating difficulty tiers is right up my alley. Encounters had surprise challenges, exploits removed, mostly, and some felt like the encounter their base version always should have been. At worst, the encounter felt like a side grade that was roughly the same. The Expliciter and Nezarec need these versions of their encounters put into Root of Nightmares ASAP. The one thing that did kinda surprise me with Pantheon was its difficulty. I didn't find it as hard as I thought it would be. I mostly LFG'd for the whole Godslayer seal, and the only time I played with genuinely bad teammates was during the Expliciter. After Root of Nightmares was released, the LFG experience got noticeably worse. There were a lot more players who wanted to be carried for raid loot. The biggest issue for me was the huge influx of no-mic players. I've never had to kick so many people out of fire teams prior to Lightfall. Thankfully, it feels like Pantheon not only corrected that, but is making people better at raiding, which is wonderful to see. I'm not saying that every player you team up with will be good, but the overall skill of players has noticeably increased. The last established activity that got meaningful content this year was exotic missions. We got 2.5 of them: Avalon, Starcrossed, and Whetstone. Unfortunately, Avalon got data leaked, which was pretty lame because it was being set up like the Whisper, where an unnoted puzzle was added in the EDZ that would then unlock the mission after solving it. I was actually very impressed with my initial playthrough of this mission. I thought that it would end after the first Hydra boss fight, but the mission just kept going. The callbacks to the Pyramidion strike were funny, including Brachion as the mission's final boss. Now, I don't know about anyone else, but I found Brachion on Legend to be low-key harder than any Master Raid or Dungeon boss I did this year. The next mission released was Whetstone. A dev blog mentioned Whetstone was meant to be a callback to D1's Black Spindle mission, and I totally see it. Whetstone is a secret extension to Deep Dives, in the same way Black Spindle was a secret extension to that King's Fall campaign mission. They also both have decently tight timers. Now, there's a subset of players who adamantly hate timers. They claim it's artificial difficulty, which is code for, I don't personally like that method of adding difficulty to an activity. Timers, in my opinion, are an excellent way to add pressure to keep you on your toes. Whetstone was one of my favorite challenges to overcome this year because of that timer. Finally, we have Starcrossed, which was the last and most mid-exotic mission of the bunch, but I'll never say no to new Black Garden content. This mission lacks some of that grand adventure, larger-than-life feel that most other exotic missions have, but it still had solid combat encounters. I still think it's infinitely better than Vox Obscura. On top of these new missions, we also received the exotic mission rotator. As of now, every old exotic mission has been re-added to the game. The only missions that I was interested in replaying were the Whisper and 0 Hour, since it had been so long since they were vaulted. The Whisper was fun to revisit, but it definitely didn't feel as hype as it was when it was released. That mission's magic was really from it being put into the game when Destiny was at its worst in early 2018. Its existence is what we really needed at that time, and it really doesn't feel as special as it used to be. On the other hand, 0 Hour went much harder than I remembered. Between the respectable combat difficulty and the fact Normal and Legend have unique platforming sections, makes this exotic mission my favorite. The other missions got past season's red borders added to them, which was a nice touch, although I have heard and read online that it is a brutal slog to farm them. As someone who had all the previous patterns prior to the rotator's existence, I cannot talk about the red border grind from experience. What I can say though is every mission needs to be available all the time. There's going to be 7 missions in the rotator once Final Shape releases. Imagine being a new player wanting to get Whisper, but you have to wait 5 weeks for it to become available. The exotic mission rotator's existence is where I want to talk about Destiny's second pain point, and I believe it's the biggest problem with Destiny in its current form, and that is the DCV. Every active Destiny player knows what the DCV is. Other YouTubers love making videos about it because it guarantees high viewership during content droughts. The DCV sparks outrage because it prevents people from being able to love the game in its entirety and prevents people like me from sharing my love of the game. Now, I understand it. When there's too many activities in Destiny, the duct tape holding this game together starts to peel off fast. Don't believe me? Look back at bug reports during Season of Arrivals and see how many activities shat the bed during that time. On paper, I think the DCV actually works. The biggest caveat of live service games is that you don't own them. I view them similarly to virtual amusement parks. You pay for a ticket to access them, but you don't own any of the attractions. This analogy works fine for the activities. I'm personally fine with seasonal activities leaving. Catch Crash is the year's pirate-themed attraction. Catch Crash does not provide anything substantially different than the Sundial or Savathûn Spire. I don't miss any of these activities because there's always a replacement of equal value. Where this analogy falls apart is when it comes to story. Imagine riding a roller coaster, feeling confused, and being told, to fully enjoy this roller coaster, you have to ride 2 other roller coasters first. But neither of them exist right now because they had to be torn down to build this one. The narrative is so fragmented due to the constant removal and repurposing of content. This is very harmful to new and returning players. Even with help from YouTube, the natural flow of experiencing story beats is completely dead. I personally enjoyed all the moments with Callus during the Lightfall campaign because of the story I formed with him throughout previous Destiny seasons. The confrontation felt personal. A new player playing through Lightfall cannot form the same connection to Callus because they can't play the Leviathan raids, Season of Opulence, and Season of the Haunted. I also really enjoyed when Osiris talked about his grief about Sagira's death to help Nimbus deal with their grief over the death of Rohan. A new player also wouldn't understand anything about Sagira because Curse of Osiris and Season of the Hunt are unplayable. My 2 favorite narrative moments from the Lightfall campaign require context that is unavailable within the same game. This is why even though I love Destiny a lot, I couldn't recommend it to someone who wants to get into its story, because in its current form, it would be nearly impossible to comprehend from scratch. The Red War and Forsaken need to return to the game. Pivotal seasonal missions, such as saving Saint 14 from the Infinite Forest, or the Sever missions from Haunted, are integral to the Destiny experience, in my opinion. My favorite character journey besides my own has to be Eris's. Watching her demeanor evolve as she tackles her survivor's guilt in Shadowkeep, to becoming a mentor to the others during Season of the Haunted, to finally becoming a temporary hive god in Season of the Witch, was a satisfying arc that cannot be experienced by anyone who didn't play all those seasons during their limited runtime. There's been some band-aid solutions, such as the timeline missions and exotic mission rotator, but a better way to help players experience Destiny's vast history is something I think needs to be added sooner rather than later. The last goal of Lightfall's year was to add social systems that brought all of Destiny's players closer together. The first set of social features were Guardian ranks and commendations. Neither of these features are that interesting, but they aren't offensively terrible. Getting a best dressed does feel nice, and Guardian ranks give a bit of guidance for how you should be progressing through the game. However, having commendation score tied to Guardian ranks is the worst part of the experience. I don't like that I have to ask randoms of my raid run for spare change after proving that I can solo the most recent dungeon. An actual notable feature releasing later in the year was the Fireteam Finder. It was delayed back one season from its original release window, and I don't think many people had high expectations for this after how trash Guided Games was when it launched 6 years ago. I'm pleased to say, Fireteam Finder is without a doubt the biggest technical accomplishment this game has ever seen. It works mostly intuitively and significantly lowers the hurdle to get into the best activities Destiny has to offer. People who are already in a dedicated LFG Discord server probably aren't going to switch, but this is huge for a vast portion of the casual player base. I think it's a little silly that setting Guardian rank requirements doesn't block people under the requirement from joining. It would actually give more of a reason for Guardian ranks to exist. The tag system mostly works, but there are holes that pop up, and that's kind of annoying. For example, you can't distinguish what checkpoint you're at during a Pantheon run. Being able to type the titles for your LFG post is the only thing about the Legacy version on the companion app that needs to be integrated. Finally, let's talk about the last major pain point Destiny has that affects how Guardians can connect: the barrier of entry. Over the last couple of years, Destiny had so many separate add-ons that it felt like we were reaching the Sims 4 levels. Thankfully, the final shape is making some positive changes that will dramatically lower the price of entry. Both the Shadowkeep and Beyond Light campaigns will be free. The Stasis subclass will also be free. This one is huge because Stasis has been neglected pretty hard the last 2 years, and it being behind a paywall felt like the biggest reason why. Now Stasis can be integrated into all future content without the limitation that a sizable chunk of the player base doesn't have access to it. Hopefully the same happens to Strand sooner rather than later, because I expect Strand to become neglected this year. Along with there now being a respectable chunk of free-to-play content, all the other packs will be bundled into a single purchase. The price hasn't been revealed yet, but I think it's safe to assume it will cost $60. However, there's one outlier: dungeons. And this is what I was talking about earlier during Warlord's Ruin. Every year since Witch Queen, a set of 2 dungeons is sold for $20. The dungeon passes have never been a problem for someone who buys the deluxe editions, but people who don't buy the edition or are new to the game have some expensive catching up to do. I think all Legacy dungeons should be a part of that Legacy bundle, or at the very least should be in a $10 Legacy dungeon bundle that gets discounted if you own some of those dungeons. The dungeon problem is only going to get worse from here as the years pile on and it keeps costing $20 for each set of dungeons. Keeping players connected is an important value of Destiny. It always sucks the air out of the room when a friend comes back to the game and they realize they must pay to access a specific piece of content. A few friends of mine came back with Into the Light and they saw my rocket pistol and wanted to get it. They weren't thrilled to learn it was behind the $20 dungeon key. So those are my thoughts of this whole year of Destiny. Destiny is a game that continues to captivate and frustrate millions with the same word: potential. Some people always see Destiny as the game that has wasted the same potential since 2014. For me, the potential I see in Destiny now isn't even remotely similar to the potential I saw in Destiny as a teenager way back in 2014. There were no darkness subclasses, subclass verbs, Witness and its disciples, alliances with Cabal and Elixni, Hive receiving the light, or a second city in the solar system. My mind is coursing with ideas and excitement of where the series can go next, and I'm eager to be a part of Destiny's second saga. Some people think that Final Shape is Destiny's curtain call. I know Destiny still has a future, because it's still the homework everyone tries to copy. There's still nothing else quite like this game, and part of me thinks, at this point, there never will be anything else quite like it. Also, why would Bungie shut support for this game? It still prints them money, and it's currently their sole source of income. Well, no matter what happens, I'll be there day one. The only way I'll stop playing is if I die, or the servers die, whichever comes first. If you watch this entire video, thank you. As someone new to making video essays, any feedback is appreciated. I'm also a new solo game developer who released their first game last month. Link for that is in the description. The game is called Survive the Storm, and it plays a lot like a strike, not a battleground. Like I said, check it out if you want to. Thanks for watching, and have a good rest of your day.